Okay, perfect. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. Hope you had a good lunch break or whatever break you have where you are. So we are moving into part 2 of the workshop. And what we wanted to do next is to now shift into looking at some case examples, right? Case studies. So my original idea for the case studies was to break into different groups, but it seems like that's really impossible almost. So instead, and also then we couldn't be recording the whole thing, right? So we decided we're just going to go through all 3 case studies in this large group. And I would like to encourage you as we go through the case studies to think a little bit about reflecting back to this morning, right? So in the back of our minds, let's have the concept of vulnerability, right? Especially the different pieces to that we looked at, like the positional power, personal power imbalances, dual roles, all of these different aspects of it. Let's keep that in the back of our minds. And then also some of the psychological and spiritual risk factors that we just reviewed in this last hour, and maybe see what is at work here. Like, what do we see in these different examples? And then a follow-up question, I guess, more towards the end, once we have gone through all 3, would be, now that we have looked at 3 examples, like how are they different in a sense of how would we respond? Would we respond exactly the same, or would there be nuances in our response? So that would be the idea. One thing I just wanted to really quickly go back to one of the last slides and the poor understanding of boundaries, because I did not mention that, and I should have, and that is there was a distinction I made, but I didn't say it out loud. It's on this slide, where we say, the process of boundary violations, it may be a process that sometimes begins as an innocent sort of like situation. But there's also the distinction that I make on the slide here, that the process may be also an intentional process, right? And that is a very different situation, and we'll see that probably in the case studies, because it can also be an intentional process where the priest is actively engaging in grooming behavior, right? So I think that's important to at least mention that, because that is unfortunately seen quite often. Sometimes that grooming behavior happens, some of it happens a little unconsciously, but many times, especially when there's a predatory motivation behind it, that's a very intentional process that is applied, sometimes over years, right? And I know we are very familiar with all of this, especially in sexual abuse of minors. Many times those are processes that, predatory, abusers have really groomed a person for years and groomed the environment of the person for years, right? Where the parents were groomed, right? The whole environment was groomed so that access was there, nobody would check, right? So that's, I think it's just important to mention that, because that also is sometimes applicable with the adult process. Okay. So then let's look at case study A. So I'm just going to read that out loud, and then maybe we can have, I would just encourage conversation, after each study. This is really more of an interactive part. So case study A. And by the way, I want to be very clear, these are case studies that they're not reflective of any particular person. They're case studies that we put together with aspects of different people over time. So they're not, real case studies of one particular person, but they're sort of like composites put together.
There are no chances at the time I named it. Not about me.
Absolutely. So Father A, that's why we're having this very inconspicuous Father A. 20-year-old diocesan priest, Father A, is in his first assignment post-seminary. He reports poor communication with his pastor, whom he states has high standards of excellence, and the newly ordained priest feels a lot of pressure to do things perfectly, with little room for error. He also reports that the pastor lives separately in a separate house, so they don't have really a communal living setting, and there's no communal activity among the priests. In other words, they're not sharing prayer time, they're also not sharing meal time, but they're very separate in their living arrangement. The newly ordained priest begins feeling quite lonely, even kind of abandoned in his duties, and also reports being very shy, right? So he's personally a very shy, introverted guy, not very connected in the parish, does not have an active group of friends, nor a priest support group. He connects with a very active group of women parishioners who see taking care of the priests as actually one of their ministries. So they're regularly coming together to pray for the priests in the parish. Sometimes they bring meals to the rectory, and at times they invite the priests for social events. So there's a very active support going on. The priest enjoys the attention and the care he receives, especially from one of the women who is in her early 40s, who finds herself in a lonely place after her husband passed away 2 years ago. She also enjoys the help she is able to provide to the priest. When he comes over to the house, the two usually pray together. At times he provides spiritual guidance for her, especially she said that she enjoys that she can ask questions that she has wondered about for a long time but never really had the opportunity to ask, so he answers those. So there's a spiritual guidance for her as well. And he also hears her confession. Over time, the connection becomes a more regular one. The initial unspoken rules, in other words, they never really spoke about any guidelines, right? But all of a sudden, the priest stays over sometimes, staying on the sofa. Sometimes they spend the whole day off together. The relationship over time evolves to a point where more emotions are involved, taking on
Your slides, please. They cannot follow me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Where are we on this third one, right? No, this we just started on that one. So the relationship over time evolves to a point where more emotions now are involved. Thank you for keeping me on track here. And so there's all of a sudden there's more emotions in the room, right? And also then things take on a little more of a romantic tone. Hand holdings, begins first a hand holding when praying, then hand holding maybe when taking a walk together. Eventually the romantic attraction is given more room and expression, and kissing evolves, cuddling. So first all of that is again more of a like non-genital expression, but then it eventually leads to a fully sexualized relationship. After a while, the woman shares with a friend that she's struggling with a strong sense of shame and guilt. So she's really, aware that, something is not right here. And when she brings it up, though, to the priest, he admits also to struggling, but he advises her to go to confession, to deal with the guilt, wanting to continue the relationship. The pressure grows in the woman, and when she talks about the experience she's having with another priest, so she's talking with another priest about the experience, and that other priest then says, you gotta, advises her to talk to someone about it. So she then reports it and brings it to the diocesan bishop. So that would be case example A. So I'm just kind of wondering, looking at that together, what do you see present in terms of some of the vulnerabilities, some of the risk factors that we talked about. So this is really open to anybody from online and
there is obviously a positional power interaction between the priest who is of the parish and the parishioner. That is one thing.
right. So positional power, he is the priest, she is a parishioner, and
A sort of like using that sort of relationship, maybe which goes over
okay.
lines, over the boundary.
Right, and also in that positional power, though, there's also he also fulfills different roles in that, right? Because it's you know, it's a complicated role. It's not like, you know, she's a parishioner who he sees at mass and that's it. But it's a parishioner who not only has come to his rectory, but then he becomes a spiritual counselor. He also is the confessor, right? And so lots of different aspects here. Archbishop?
The effective needs on both sides, particularly is country health, environment, which is the expectations, that is the support is finding the inability to recognize what's happening in terms of his needs and these people, and this one particularly responsible.
So both people with a whole number of personal needs that are happening in their lives that they are more or less aware of, right? Because we're talking about the needs on the priest side. He is in a situation where he, you know, is not very connected. He feels isolated. He feels lonely. He really feels like the pastor is not listening to him. By the way, when I do workshops for newly ordained priests anywhere in North America, I would say, what do you think is the number one complaint that the newly ordained priests say? Is complaints about their pastor. Complaints about their pastor because very often they feel like there is no communication, right? Or it's a one-way communication. The pastor tells them what to do, but they really don't feel like they may be listened to. And this is generalizing, right? There's other examples also, but in general, the number one complaint is poor relationships with the first pastor. Carly.
My first remark is the people cannot hear the remark. So I would ask you to take it, reframe it.
Yes.
First, thank you. And then what they have written. It's not my remarks. It is the woman is very vulnerable to the priest because of her widowhood and his role as her confessor and spiritual guide. And someone else says, yes, but the priest is vulnerable because of his youth, his isolation, and his lack of support during this time.
Right, so I hope people heard that, right? So let me repeat that also. So this is from an online comment from one of the online participants. So one person said the woman is very vulnerable because of the fact that she recently lost her husband, right? So she's in grief. There's a grieving process going on. Was there something else about the woman?
It was her widowhood and his role as confessor.
And also very important, that person points out that the priest also is her confessor, right? So that's a whole other, aspect to this relationship. And then another person said, yes, but the priest also is vulnerable because he is young and he is isolated.
And no support. And
has very low support. Any other comments? I mean, so clearly, right, this is not a clear-cut case, so to speak, in terms of we have a predator priest. This is the case A I put here because it's not a clear-cut case of like, okay, here we have grooming behavior, predatory intentions. That's not how this starts, right? It starts like a innocent, relationship that actually in the beginning is mutually satisfactory and safe and enjoyable. Both parties, the priest and the parishioner, enjoy actually the interaction, right? They're both benefiting from the relationship, the pastoral relationship, to a certain point, right? So I think that's important to recognize because, yes, in our pastoral interactions, there is that element, where, the priest provides a ministry, but also in return, obviously receives a lot of, wonderful things back in return. But where do you think it crosses? Where do we begin with a boundary crossing? Maybe not a boundary violation. Where do you think it kind of like goes over a certain threshold?
I would suggest when he starts ministering to her in her home, when there's no need for him to be going to her home to do that kind of thing.
Okay, so answer is, when he comes to her home and then in the home continues to minister to her in this role, right? So I think that's an important aspect, right? Because all of a sudden, now, he already was invited into her home, which is really another level of intimacy, if you want to say so, right? Because you're trusting the person, you're inviting them to their home. So that's, I think, where it becomes more of a danger zone in a sense, right? And then it's interesting that the priest at that time, because he's decided that he still, took on that role of, okay, I'm coming over to your place. I'm going to continue to counsel you. I'm going to continue to be your confessor. I'm going to continue to, spend all this time. So the roles become very mixed, right? So because in 1 minute at their home, they're praying together and he hears their confession. And then the next hour, they're maybe fixing a meal together and then they're holding hands, right? So it becomes really enmeshed very quickly.
Our participants online are very active. So the first is when the relationship becomes special or exclusive. I read them all and then another person says he crosses another boundary when he advises her to go to confession but continues the relationship. He is downplaying her struggle with shame and guilt. Someone else says, depending on the way the confessional relationship has been handled by the priest, he may be in danger of violating the canon law that forbids the remission of the sins related to their section. And finally,
Okay, so let's because that's it's very active. I just remember sadly the last one. It's a recency effect, right? So the last one was the confessional, the role as a confessor, because I think that's a really, really important point. As a confessor, how can he be in the role of, giving the sacrament of reconciliation when it involves him in the relationship that she is confessing, right? So I think that was one of the points that was made by the priest. So that is already a very, I'm not the canon lawyer. Just psychologically, I would say that's a blending of, talk about dual roles in a really, in a very problematic way. And apparently canon law has something to say about that as well. So the other one was about the crossing. I do remember another one. The crossing of the boundary occurred, this person said, when the relationship started to become special. And I think that is really, that's one of those markers that we usually use. And I had it on one of the slides, right? The other person becomes special. They're no longer, the parishioner who helps out and who I appreciate bringing meals and, because all of that is still within the realm of like, acceptable things. But when that person then very quickly takes on that very special status, right? And in this case, I would assume the priest then for her also started to make exceptions that he probably would not make for other people, right? So the specialness of the relationship really started to loosen or weaken the boundary.
I came to sit here so that you do not
Perfect.
have to repeat
Oh.
my things. I'm close to the mic. So I like a canon lawyer online here. Yeah, I know her. So he crosses, I like this, so I would like you to say something on it. He crosses another boundary when he advises her to go to confession, but continues the relationship. He downplays her struggle with shame and guilt. So it gives on the one side the impression it's not good, go to confession, but he continues the relationship.
Right, but that for me it shows, at that point, he clearly has crossed into, absolutely using her to his benefit, right? Because at that point, it's, he basically is saying, fine, if you feel guilty about it, do something about it. But what we're doing is still good. And that's also where, I didn't put this in here, that's where spiritualization very often gets heaped on very badly. Because then it's like, go to confession, take care of it, but what we have is pure and holy, and it helps both of us, then you get all of these things added into the mix, which, really makes it impossible for the other person to even find a way out.
So yes.
Yeah, just to add, here it is quite strange, and most often you must have heard that. Persons who have suffered go to seek for help or talk about it, but not the abuser. He doesn't feel that he's wrong, or he has to seek help or whatever to clarify about himself. At least I do not see in this particular case section. Is that the way it usually happens?
It's very common. So the point was that it's also striking in this example that the one party in this, the woman, is much faster having a recognition that something is not right here, right? This is not okay. Yet the priests, in the role of the abuser at that stage, that's what we called with the cognitive distortions, right? There's then the cognitive distortions going on in his mind that, no, this is okay. There's all kinds of things happening where he legitimizes their behavior. Unfortunately, it is not, that's really the common denominator when we see someone for assessment in a situation like this. The first thing really, in assessment is to really shine a light on what really happened, right? Because that's when, in the beginning, you get a lot of denial and you get a lot of downplaying, minimizing, and you get cognitive distortions such as saying things, maybe admitting to some things like, oh yeah, well, and then, then I went too far. Okay. That's an interesting statement, but it says nothing. What do you mean you went too far, right? Because then you get these generalizations and then you have to really kind of go through, well, what do you mean, going too far? When did that happen and what does that mean, right? So it's the first part really of any assessment, or even the beginning part of any kind of treatment, if it's possible, is to get to a recognition of the reality, right? To get to a recognition of this is what occurred. And it would not be unlikely also in this situation that when we do an assessment of this priest, that he would be very much erring on one side of this equation, which is, well, no, this was very mutual. I never forced a thing. No, she invited me over, right? She did, yes. So she would go through all of those things. And it was never him. Because the line that then we hear most often is, no, she really, it was her who forced me. It's almost like I'm the, right?
I'm the victim.
So that would not be uncommon, right? So there's a confrontational aspect also, unfortunately, in this kind of assessment, because you have to really confront the person with the reality, with the facts. And yet, I also want to be clear, what we see in this, and we're going to probably clarify this when we go on to the next two, is it didn't start, this is not a priest who I would see as a predatory priest. This is, I think, a priest where, there is a room in treatment to work with this kind of person, right? Would that be successful or not? A lot of factors depend on that, but why don't we go to case study B and see, unless there's more questions for A.
Well, I would like
There's more for A,
honor a
yeah.
little bit
Sure.
what they write, because they participate well. So this is another kind of intervention. Perhaps the priest has an underdeveloped affective maturity if he is shy and potentially relying on the woman to have the boundaries and needs to be told no. It starts when he goes to her home, to casual and private. Also an issue of potential canonical crime, if using confessional to encourage the violation relationship in forgiving her transgressions. So here we get, I think, to try to say what was wrong with him, the underdeveloped.
Yeah, I think, absolutely correct. Right, the affective immaturity on this person's part is really striking, right? And then using, and we'll see this also in the next one, the next case study, using or like projecting his own struggle, right, with loneliness and everything, and then just projecting that onto her. So unfortunately, it's very common.
Okay, I think the one we can.
Okay, and we can come back, because I think, why don't we go on to case study B, because it's slightly different, and yet many of the things obviously are connectors. Okay, go to the next slide, Stefan. Good. All right, so this priest, Father B, is in his mid-30s, and he has been functioning well in his assignments as a parochial vicar, where he enjoyed the priestly fraternity with the pastor, reported benefiting from the support provided. He is now assigned as a first-time pastor in his own parish, and again is seemingly doing well, being experienced by parishioners as charismatic, outgoing, and open-minded. What is not known to parishioners or to anybody in the priest's closest circle is that Father B has known about his sexual attractions to men for many years, but has never engaged in a process of coming to terms with his sexual orientation. In fact, it seems to be one of the few areas in his preaching where parishioners have noticed a more negative, even homophobic tone. Right? So he's perceived as charismatic, open-minded, but when it comes to topics that evolve around that, he takes on a very rigid homophobic tone. So a parishioner from a neighboring parish visits Father B's parish often on a Saturday to receive the sacrament of reconciliation. That parishioner says he prefers going to a priest he does not know, as he struggles with what he calls same-sex attraction, and he also struggles with pornography habits he's not proud of. So he feels more comfortable, right? I don't want to confess this to my own priest, goes to a neighboring parish. I think very common practice, right? A little bit more anonymity. So Father B takes the confessional conversation into a direction that seemingly satisfied his curiosity more than it was helpful for the penitent. Father B also stated that the penitent clearly needed help and offered to provide that help outside of the confession. The help that ensued outside of the confessional consisted very quickly in attempts to connect with the penitent in the romantic and then sexualized manner. The penitent, being traumatized by the experience, went and reported it. So, same questions that we applied to the first one. What do we see here? What about vulnerabilities? What about the contributing risk factors? Slightly different situation, right?
I think in a sense here, there's, contrary to the first case, right at the beginning, there's an intention on the part of this to use this person for his own ends. There's no, in a sense, slowly getting into a relationship where the two kind of find mutual satisfaction. There's really more right away. It's kind of a violation of that.
So it seems like in this case, it's being said that there's more of an intentionality right in the beginning. It's not like a process that's kind of growing between two people, but in the confessional, and in the confessional, very quickly, it seems like, the priest sees an opportunity and intentionally goes for exploitation, really, of a struggle of the person that's coming for confession, right? Yes.
Especially that he struggled with sexuality.
Right. So the point, so that he's struggling with his own sexuality, right? So here's Father B in the confessional, and he has not really come to any kind of acceptance or integration of his sexual orientation, right? So it's sort of like an unresolved situation for him. And then he sees the opportunity, well, this man, so it's sort of like an opportunity to somehow further his own, process of exploration, right? Yeah.
How much of it is intentional on his part in terms of the choice of making it that? This is unintegrated sexuality is on display there. The fact that it's close to certain of his attraction.
Right.
Just that it's an area of like just waiting to go off, like a landmine beneath the surface. This man comes to him in confession, confesses that which is the trigger for him, the unintegrated part of himself. Man steps on the trigger,
Right.
and it blows up.
Right. So the point here is that, the man who came to confess sort of like stepped on the trigger of the landmine that has been there for a while, right? Because the priest completely has failed to integrate his sexuality, right? So it's sort of like this open wound, in a sense. And this, person that comes to confession steps right into that. But your initial question was how much of that is in the control really of the priest, right? And so I would say, the interesting part is the control of what he does with what is being stirred up with him, right? That is absolutely under his control, right? The fact that it's stirring up all kinds of stuff should have brought him to do what? Should have brought him to the next day call his therapist and say, wow, I just really felt completely, I didn't even know how to handle this because this just happened, and right? So the fact that it stirred up, it reminds me of like the whole process of like transference, countertransference, right, in therapy, where of course sometimes, clients will touch on something that stirs up all kinds of things, right? But then the onus is on the professional to navigate that, right? Because the penitent clearly wants safety and clarity in the roles here, right? Interestingly, and I remember my, confessional counseling class, decades ago, by a good Jesuit canon lawyer, where he really always reminded us, he says, I know how much you guys enjoy counseling, but he says, keep in mind that the penitent comes for a specific reason. And if they're not asking to be counseled, he says, don't counsel them. They're coming for absolution. That's the purpose, right? So don't get lost in this counseling bit, which very easily can derail. So I think that's a really good reminder here, right?
I suppose what was going through my mind there is that how much of it is conscious on his part? The student, or how much of it is another?
Right. So the question is, how much of it is conscious for the priest? However, we have that answered in the case study because it says that he has been aware for many years of his attraction to men. It's just that he has never explored it, right? He has never really done his part of like, what do I do with this, right? So we have one more here, and I'm sure there's some online.
Just, even comparing the other case that you presented, in both the cases, how is that you feel that these priests do not go to confront of their own case with somebody else? At least we cannot see in the presentation. Whether it be spiritually, whether it be psychologically, whether it be with an authority. Often enough, that's what happens, doesn't it? The priest doesn't go to seek help.
Right. That unfortunately happens a lot, right? And it's interesting because sometimes priests even get upset when in my interaction sometimes, especially when we talk about boundaries, right? So in one-on-one interactions, I always say to the priests in the assessment process, when we do the psychosexual part, I always tell them, it is not a question of will you find yourself attracted to a parishioner, as a therapist to a client, as a teacher to a student. The question is not, will that happen? I think the realistic question is, when will that happen? And then are you honest enough to raise the flag and to say, whoa, I need to talk to someone, right? But and priests many times get upset about simply asking that question because it's like, well, no, that's not going to happen. Yes, it's going to happen. Right? It will happen. It's very unlikely that it will not occur for you. But there is this underlying thing, which we will explore also in the last part of it. There is this belief somehow embedded in a lot of the priests and also in a lot of the bishops, if I may say, that somehow sexuality will go away. There's somehow this unspoken thing that somehow with ordination, somehow the grace of the bishop's hand on your head somehow pushes some button that makes your sexuality go away. And obviously that's not the case. Actually, the case is that it becomes more complicated because you are most likely a man in his late 20s who has said no to any sexual activity without much help of how. Because the seminarians we interviewed, they would say, if I hear one more thing that tells us not to do this and not to do that, we get that. But what do I do instead? Right? So I think the groundwork is laid for a lot of confusion. And then, if you think about that, then that thought of somehow sexuality, then sometimes priests say, well, it must become easier when I'm in my 50s. It must become easier in my 60s. And we always say, from speaking from our experiences with priests across the age range, it won't get easier. That's also, though, when I think in society, we get this strange thing where I remember, if you remember this, but a few years ago, there was like this uproar because a study had come out that talked about the rate of sexually transmitted diseases in nursing homes. And when that study came out, people were up in arms and they said, no, these people don't have sex. They're old, they're in nursing homes. So I mean, the assumption, right, is like at some age level that just somehow just no, right? And so when we talk to priests, it's like, this will always be an issue, always. So we might as well start being honest about it. I don't know how I got into that now, but so online, what do we have online?
So first I had a number of remarks about the sexual identity that I think we have about that. Someone is also talking about transference and counter-transference, which you also addressed. But here I have another topic. I am concerned that given how quickly this situation evolved, that there may be others who have had the same experience. There is also the canon that prevents solicitation from sex within and in fact also around confessional. It is unclear if this was really the case. I could have a predator in that case.
I think the person is absolutely right on the mark, right? We don't know. And in this kind of a situation, because it was such a, it was without hesitation, right? So like this person came in, seemed like a perfect target because of the situation. And the person immediately, you know, jumped on that. So it's, would it be likely that there might be others? Yes, right. And that's the other thing, by the way, in an assessment, many times the reality is that you kind of like when you start sort of like scratching the surface and giving some room, most of the time you then learn about other situations that may not have been a full sexual abuse, but many situations of boundary crossings, like getting closer to that moment, right? So, but all of that, of course, is not known at first because he never talked with anybody about any of the issues he had.
Loaded.
Do you think how fast he approached the other men meant that he probably had before other person that he did the same thing? Maybe at first it's less. I don't know.
You know, so the question is, again, the speed with which this happened, would this maybe tell us that this had happened before, right? We don't know. I mean, it's likely, but it could also be that it is indeed the first time. Because remember, this priest also now is in a slightly different situation. Before he was embedded in, he's now assigned by himself. So there's also a change in the reality of the priest's life. He actually enjoyed the camaraderie. He had said he talked about the fraternal. He felt good with the pastor and the other people. And now he's by himself. So the other question is, you know, now that he's on his own, you know, where are the supports? But also, you know, maybe now being on his own, you know, is that also like, are the floodgates open to him, you know, having no accountability? Because before, when you lived with others in the house, there was the level of accountability because other priests would know when you're coming and going kind of thing. And now he's by himself. So maybe that also lowered his inhibitions, right?
There is another bishop present here, and he says it looks like he has probably incurred a delicti in using information obtained in the confessional. So it's a sin against the Sixth Amendment. Yeah, he must be.
We have a lot of canonists on this call.
So the question is it a delay? Did he use the information he got in the confessional for getting, in fact, this relationship?
Well, he obviously did, but I did not say that it was breaking the seal,
Solicitatio.
right?
Solicitatio.
Yeah, it was solicitation, because in the act of the occasion or pretext of confession, soliciting something. And in fact, it's a most greatly like reserved to the Holy See if the solicit, but the object of the solicitation is the confession itself.
Okay, I don't dare to repeat what was just said because that's very technical. So
I tried to repeat it because
Right, so, but I think the bottom line though was that he didn't, like in a classic sense, break the seal of confession because he didn't talk about this with anybody else, but it was a clear case of solicitation, right? Where because of the, information that he obtained, then he used that to solicit the other person.
Breaking the seal involves going to something else. Solicitation involves going. That's the distinction.
And the worst is because it was the confessor himself.
Right. Which then, by the way, just to look for a second also, I think this is also important to also, because I know we're looking a lot at, the contributing factors to the priest, but not to lose sight of the damage that this does, right, to the victim survivor in this case, because I mean, this person very honestly was in a struggle that the priest never actually dared to go to, right? Because this person was already like dealing with their sexuality. They were trying to figure it out. They were trying to, and guess what? In that process, they were trusting the priest, to give absolution and to take away some of that guilt and shame that they were feeling in order to explore more honestly their own sexuality. And the priest totally ignored that and just, imposed all of his own stuff on that person. So, I mean, the damage that's done is really just enormous.
So another question is about the formation of seminarians, but I think we also said already something like that. And then there is someone who says whether it's solicitation or no, there should be a process to determine that finally. But okay, we are just discussing.
So should we maybe go to case C?
Yes, I think so.
Because we have yet another variety of something, and that's a briefer one. So Father C, I know not very creative, but ABC, okay? Father C, a religious order priest, so the other two were diocesan priests, so this is a religious order priest in his 50s, has served in various assignments on several continents. He was the head of vocations ministry, then headed up the formation of novices, and has transitioned into spiritual direction at present. The incident that brought attention to his case was when a spiritual directee, a woman religious, came forward with a complaint that Father C had become manipulative in spiritual direction, eliciting material favors, such as permission to stay in various locations of the order for retreats for vacation days, then increasingly becoming demanding of the sister's services for him personally in and around the parish and rectory, then proceeding to personal favors such as massages, etc. Sister eventually talked with her provincial leadership, who reported this to authorities. It then came to light that Father C had used each of his assignments to abuse his authority over others. In retrospect, it was discovered that several young men who were interested in seminary formation, who participated in come and see vocation weekends, came forward to talk about Father C's unusual requests, which they followed due to the fact that he was the person who would decide who receives the green light to move ahead. As well, in a different country, one of the novices came forward to share their story of Father C fostering a dependency on him and his guidance, also leading to sexual favors. So, same questions. What do we see here in terms of vulnerability and the contributing risk factors, etc.? Yes. So clearly, abuse of power in each situation, right? Because his power was in one realm was as a novice master, so he had power over the novices. Abuse of power as a vocations person, and then abuse of power as a spiritual director and confessor, I guess, or spiritual direction for the woman religious, right? Clearly, yes.
There's also something that you had mentioned this morning. It's kind of it's not just sexual in nature, this abuse. It's also all kinds of favors.
Yes.
Services, places to stay.
Yes. right? So this one is really across, so this is not just sexual abuse, but it's really abuse of power across the board, right? It also is, well, I shouldn't say that. Let's see if somebody points that out, because there's also something that's uniquely different in this one.
There is someone who said it's an abuse of conscience and authority.
I really, an abuse of conscience, right, and authority, yes. Clearly, yes.
Can we talk about somebody that that
Right, so this, in this case, the word predator really is the one of the three cases, I think, where that jumps off page most easily. Because we see with him, right, there's an intentionality of, predatory behavior. And also, interestingly enough, I mean, his predatory behavior does not follow the lines of sex or gender, right? Because he, abuses across the board. He abuses men, he abuses women. So it's really more of a, like, if this was in the realm of minors, we would call this person this is what classic, like a situational generalist, right? Somebody who, as a predator, knows what he wants, and he will go after it, seeing where the openings occur, where there's access, right? So he had access with the sister who he counseled, so she became the target. He had access to the vulnerable population of the novices. That's what he did. He had access to people in the vocations, right? That's where he abused. So it's really across the spectrum here.
I mean, you can clearly see that he's grooming them as well. So he's asking for these favors. He kind of builds up.
Yes.
Slightly wants the water each time.
Yes.
To get to the place where he wants. He does that again and again.
Right.
Different contexts.
So the grooming that's pointed out here, right, and that's very much, grooming is a very much part of a predatory kind of a process, right? Also at display here. And imagine this is, sadly, I mean, this happened in wherever he was, different continents, so like right? And it never really surfaced until, the sister came forward and reported it. Rafael.
he see his limits, he tried and see all the limits where he can try everyone, so you see the limits that he tried.
Yeah, so he tried in each.
Like he tried something with his sister and he saw his limits and go to somewhere else.
Right. Right. And all done in, like, how can I maximize my pleasure? Right. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I do see also maybe a little different from the other two cases. Here, there's sort of a manipulative relationship that he's establishing with all the people wherever he was, which was not so, at least in the other two cases. At least it grew into, or they did not face their vulnerabilities. Here, he was almost sure of what he is and what he wants to do. So he manipulates the people around.
Yes. Yes. And also I think what you're describing is that in this case, if this person came in for an assessment, we would most likely see in this person a highly pronounced, clinical narcissism, and most likely he would actually test, on the psychopathic scales, right? So he would really, this person is more like a psychopathic predator, right? Which distinguishes him from the other two cases, right? So it's yeah. Anything from online?
No, for the moment they are
Okay.
quiet.
Well, then why don't we move on, because we only have 5 minutes, but move on to I had a couple of more questions here, and that is, we answered many of them already. And so that is, I think we answered the questions to vulnerability, the positional power differences, dual roles. But so I would like to go to the third line from the bottom. Should the responses to all be the same? No. not so. So say more about that. Like, should there, why not? So one could say, these are all boundary violations with vulnerable adults. Why not have one and the same response?
Because they're different violations. The last man is obviously corrupt, it's long, it's passive, it's dimensional. And the others, for all we know, these sort of single, isolated instances, they were young people that were able to form, reform.
Okay,
I
so,
see a-
so the answer is clearly not, because they're multifaceted events with very different motivating factors, levels of severity, etc. So the one and the same response would not be applicable here, right? Archbishop?
Well, what the thing that I find ironic is the third case, which is the one that I think everybody agrees is the most egregious, is the one that doesn't seem to automatically bring about canonical penalties. You know, for the first two, because there's confession involved, you know, there's canonical fault, dealings. Here, where's the dealing? You know, it's.
So this is interesting, right? Because we're saying that, so this is, we have to be nuanced. It has to be case by case. However, I think there's probably also another common shared denominator is that does every case warrant an intervention? And yes, right? So clearly the severity of each case is one where we would say, yes, this is a boundary crossing or a boundary violation, or in all cases, actually sexual misconduct including against a vulnerable adult. Therefore, a response is absolutely necessary, right? So that's, I think, so that's clear. Just how we respond, you know, that I think for me, and this is going back to this morning after our first presentation, right, when we look at vulnerability, the importance is, I think, that we grow into a place where there's clarity about these power imbalances, right? Where there's clarity about the need to respond, not to look the other way, right? But to respond and to respond clearly. But then at the same time, like with everything, you know, be nuanced case by case, because every case is different. And I think, you know, that's also something that we see at Southdown, which, you know, there's such a variety of people that come to us. There's some, so for example, case C, like if I was being asked, I would say we do not accept this person for even as an admission, because there is no treatment possible, right? Because this person comes as a psychopathic predator, there is really no treatment. He needs to be managed somehow, you know, but there's no room for treatment. Now with the other two, I think there's some room to work with these people, but again, that has to be very nuanced. Okay, we're out of time for this segment. Are we anything from online?
I think you answered the question. That's what I'm answering now.
We have one more from in the room here.
Yeah, oh no, there is one new one, but you go first.
Archbishop Dorsey's pointed in the direction of systemic blind spots. So if nothing is in the canon law, address that particular situation, that there's a systemic where we actually turn a blind eye on many situations because it's not covered.
Exactly. So that.
It is now.
So this is important, right? So the record, right, said that the Archbishop's comment was well taken, because Archbishop Durocher said that, you know, it's funny, not funny, but it's ironic that the one case that seems so clearly predatory is sort of like a loophole in canon law, right? And so therefore the comment was it would point to sort of like a systemic blind spot, and yet we get a vehement response
from this on is code.
Right, from December 8th on, with the new code, with the
Yes.
new,
I would say this new book 6, oh, that becomes effective, promulgated Pentecost, effective Immaculate Conception. On the one hand, it broadens and expands the existing law, but there's even some of these pieces of the law came about just most essence 2019 that speaks of vulnerable persons. We've got vulnerable persons in all three
yes.
So the thing is, about the first two, it's commonly known, old, long-time existing delicts. But what's missing, and this is something we have to weave into the ordinary life of the church, is that now there is a new deal. Probably for some, since whatever day, June 1st of 2019, verbose estis, but it became effective. But certainly now, even for lay people in church leadership, you can commit this delict, both abuse of authority and sexual abuse. Now, another trivia is related to this. The new code does not use the word vulnerable person.
Go to the mic.
So, yeah, otherwise we have to repeat
Yes.
everything.
Well, do I think?
No.
Okay, well-
Lawyer is going to explain it.
Yeah.
You have to explain first your thing of processes looks for vulnerable persons, and second, this change in the book 6. One is good.
Sorry.
Okay, I would say that all three of these cases involve vulnerable persons. There's no doubt about that. That's the point of the workshop. The first two involve vulnerable persons where the priest involved is committing objectively at least some delict, whether that's soliciting into a confession, whether that's absolving an accomplice, whatever. And those are well-known and long-standing delicts in the church from actually centuries ago. Both codes of canon law, but they repeat things from the 1600s, 1400s, and so on. The point, beginning though on the 1st of June in 2019, an apostolic letter was issued by Pope Francis called Vos estis lux mundi, you are the light of the world. And in that, the Pope introduced two new kinds of delicts. The one was the delict involving bishops and their equivalents who cover up abuse maliciously, not by negligence. That was something else in 2018. So both if a bishop covers up abuse, whether by negligence or by maliciousness, deceit, he's committing a delict. But in this Vos estis lux mundi, another delict was introduced, and that is the delict of sexual abuse, if we may use that word, sexual abuse of vulnerable persons. And that's where Stephen gave us before the definition in the first session from that document, Vos estis. It's those who even temporarily and so on may not have the freedom to choose otherwise or to escape the situation. Also, Vos estis extended for the first time clearly in church history the delict of sexual abuse of minors and now also vulnerable adults to include religious predators, men and women, clergy religious and lay religious predators, religious institutes, secular institutes, societies of apostolic life. Now we have the new book 6 of the Code of Canon Law that's coming out. That's out. We're in the vacation time now, which means we're supposed to learn it. And the new code does a few things. It includes all of the above, all of the novelties, innovations that I've just mentioned. But it also specifically speaks of abuse of authority. It speaks of sexual abuse as a result of threats, of force, and adds in the abuse of authority. Now, that's a new phrase that Pope Francis introduced both in the McCarrick affair, but also in response to the problems of the church in Chile. So abuse of authority, and that is now a separate freestanding canon. This canon is still up among the canons of the code dealing with delicts against special obligations, here clerical obligations. But then there's a whole nother long canon 1398 to number drop, 1398, that's positioned in another part of the code. And the title for these several canons in this part are delicts against life, dignity, and human freedom, is it? And human freedom, I think. So now the abuse of minors, those who are equivalent to minors, those who habitually lack the use of reason, and what we'll call vulnerable persons, are seen not as delicts against a cleric's violation of the pristine dignity of the priesthood or celibacy, but rather, rightly, violations against the human dignity of the victims. Two more little things and I'll come back. Well, I mean, but this is it.
Yeah.
But this is it.
Delete.
Lay people are now also, will be, just as religious were with Vocestus, now all lay people who are in leadership roles in the church or whoever holds some dignity, jurisprudence needs to define what that means, are perpetrators of sexual abuse of these minors, vulnerable persons, those the equivalent, and also that earlier canon still under abuse of their office, because they would be office holders, whether volunteers or formally holding an ecclesiastical office. Finally, this, I said 2 points. This is the last of the two. This point also is the new code does not use, this new book 6 does not use the term vulnerable person, which Francis introduced, both for Vatican City State and also for the whole world in Vocestus, but rather uses the phrase sexual abuse against those to whom the law grants equal protection of law. Well, on the one hand, that's not helpful, but the problem with the Vatican drafting was, this was a group of canonists from throughout the world who've been doing this for 10 years and so on. The problem they have with vulnerable persons is that it's not a univocal term. As I develop a friendship, as we develop relationships with people, you become vulnerable. You walk into the water, you walk into the water. I reveal a little bit of me, you reveal a little bit about you, and you gradually grow and become friends, or you don't. Vulnerable, though, can be therefore a good thing, necessary for a necessary fundament for healthy relationships, but it can also be this devastating. So we almost distinguish in canon law positive, healthy vulnerability and destructive or abusive or manipulative vulnerability. And again, jurisprudence is going to have to do this. I hope we someday find a term that is shorter than those to whom the law grants equal protection. But for right now, that's what we've got. And maybe it's going to be negative vulnerability. So that's all.
All right. I have to wrestle back the microphone. So, all right, thank you very much. I think this was a great conclusion because we're already 8 minutes over now. So why don't we take a break? Thank you for all the participation online also. That was really great to hear from all of you. And the next concluding part of this is looking into what can be done, preventative work. And I think that's another part where there's wide open, really my hope would be to elicit a lot of comments for what can be done in terms of prevention, right? Because hopefully people also have comments for that. So let's take a quick break. We'll be back at the half hour.
Indeed.
Please don't touch.